Did you know that a gay Jewish doctor became the world's first queer rights superhero? Hi there, I'm Chris with a K, and welcome back to This Week in Queer History, where we celebrate queer moments and icons that I wish I had known about as a young gay kid growing up in conservative America. Almost 130 years ago, Magnus Hirschfeld started publicly standing up for LGBTQ rights. His fight and legacy are a shining example of how you show up when dictators and regimes rise up against you. This is something that America needs to start preparing for, so grab your coffee, your protest signs, and maybe a cupcake, because this is going to be a fun ride.
This week in queer history, stories told with love and glee.
Magnus Hirschfeld was born in 1868 in the Kingdom of Prussia, which is now a town in Poland called Kolobrzeg. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. Anyway, imagine being a young queer Jewish kid in a conservative environment. He was the son of a respected doctor. He attended a Protestant school where he didn't quite fit the mold that everyone expected him to. Does that sound familiar? Well, it's the same tension that many of us feel growing up in conservative America. We're expected to hide parts of ourselves just to survive. After studying philosophy, linguistics, and medicine, Hirschfeld traveled the world. He observed queer subcultures in places like Chicago, Rio, Tokyo, and Tangier, and this all confirmed what he felt deep down inside. The queerness was universal, and it was not just a Western invention, and it wasn't just a phase. It was very human. In 1897, Hirschfeld founded the Scientific Humanitarian Committee. This was the world's first LGBTQ rights organization, and he did this alongside Max Spohr, Edward Oberg, and Franz Joseph von Bülow. Their motto, "Through Science to Justice," was revolutionary, using data and medical research to argue that homosexuality was natural and should not be criminalized, especially under Germany's paragraph 175, which was an extremely inhumane law that punished queer people simply for existing. They gathered over 6,000 signatures, including Albert Einstein, Thomas Mann, and Leo Tolstoy, all fighting to repeal paragraph 175. And these weren't fringe radicals, they were some of the greatest minds of their time, all standing up for queer rights. Hirschfeld believed sexuality and gender existed on a spectrum. He coined the term transvestite in 1910 and helped some of the first transgender people get gender-affirming surgeries and legal documents. This was all at a time when most doctors just wanted to cure queer people. Hirschfeld, he provided care, shelter, and a sense of dignity. He also co-wrote and appeared in the 1919 film Different from the Others. This was the first pro-gay rights film, and it showed the dangers of blackmail and persecution under the anti-queer laws of the time. At the end of the film, Hirschfeld had a message: through knowledge to justice. You can check out more of that film by clicking the link up above and also down in the description below. I have a full video about that movie. Hirschfeld's Institute in Berlin became a haven for queer people from across Europe, with medical care, research, and also the Museum of Sex, which was visited by school classes from all over. It was a space of joy and knowledge in a world trying to erase queer existence. As the Weimar Republic flourished, Berlin became a beacon of queer life, filled with cabarets, queer clubs, and activists fighting for liberation. Hirschfeld's Institute stood as a symbol of hope and possibility, with people like Christopher Isherwood and W.H. Auden visiting. They were all pulled to Berlin by the freedom that they could taste in the air. But freedom always has a fragile edge. As fascism rose in Germany, so did attacks on Hirschfeld. In 1920, he was brutally beaten by far-right nationalists and left for dead in the street. This was a stark reminder of the violence that queer activists often face when they dare to stand up and be visible. But still, Hirschfeld refused to be silenced. He continued to speak out, organize conferences, and build global networks through the World League for Sexual Reform. In 1930, as the Nazis gained power, Hirschfeld predicted that there would be no future for people like him in Germany. So he went on a world tour, visiting the US, Japan, and China, meeting queer communities, feminists, and sexologists, learning and sharing in return. He even met his partner, Li Xiutong, in Shanghai, who would stay with him for the rest of his life. On May 6, 1933, less than 4 months after Hitler rose to power, Nazi students and the SA stormed the institute, looting and seizing Hirschfeld's irreplaceable archives. Days later, in front of a cheering crowd, they burned the books and research that Hirschfeld had spent decades compiling, symbolizing the Nazis' goal to erase queer knowledge and lives. Imagine standing there watching all of that knowledge and history burn because of fear and intolerance. Hirschfeld never returned to Germany. He spent his final years in exile in France, still writing and still dreaming of justice, and still advocating for queer people until his death, which was in 1935 on his 67th birthday. Throughout all of this, Hirschfeld embodied the power of showing up, even when it's dangerous. His work laid the foundation for LGBTQ activism, influencing figures like Henry Gerber and the Mattachine Society in the US, and the many other queer activists who have followed, including us, here and now, as we continue the fight. And here's where it all ties back to us today. Hirschfeld lived in a time of fragile openness, just like we've had over the last few decades. Berlin's queer spaces, protests, and cabarets, they were all a burst of color and laughter against a looming conservative backlash. Yeah. Does that sound familiar? In our time, we've seen decades of LGBTQ progress, and now we're facing waves of backlash, book bans, anti-trans laws, and the erasure of us from public spaces. Think of the US NS Harvey Milk. So when you see footage of Nazis burning Hirschfeld's archives, think about school boards banning queer books or lawmakers attacking trans kids. It's the same playbook of erasure, fear, and control. And yet Hirschfeld's legacy reminds us that we don't give up. That's why it matters to gather at Pride, to dance together at queer clubs, to show up at rallies with our signs, and to build community around queer joy. Hirschfeld's story isn't just about loss. It's about choosing to live, to love, to resist, and to take care of each other in the face of rising hate. So when I think of Magnus Hirschfeld, I think of a man who, despite getting beaten and exiled and losing everything to fascists, he still chose to live with purpose, and he continued to fight for queer rights until the day he died. So how do we honor Hirschfeld's legacy? By standing out and speaking out. It's how we protect each other too. And it's how we make sure queer joy remains an act of defiance, a refusal to be erased, and a celebration of shared humanity. Sometimes I think about what it must have felt like to walk into a queer club in 1920s Berlin under those glowing cabaret lights, and your heart is pounding as you step into the room where you can finally exhale, and you knew that just outside that door, laws like paragraph 175 could end your life, that police raids and society's disgust of you were just beyond that door. And yet people still showed up. And they danced, they flirted, they kissed, and they built community in the shadows of real danger, because that moment of joy inside that room was worth it. That's what I think about when I think of Magnus Hirschfeld's era and the vibrant queer life in Weimar, Berlin. It reminds me of the first time that I held my first boyfriend's hand in public. I was terrified, but I was unwilling to hide who I was anymore. Or when I walked out onto the street for my first Pride, not sure if I would be seen or if I'd be safe, but knowing that I needed to be there. Hirschfeld's time was not so different from ours. In the Weimar Republic, there was this fragile openness. A city like Berlin was buzzing with queer spaces, sexology research, and a movement fighting for rights. But beneath that was a constant tension. A conservative backlash was gaining strength, waiting for its moment to clamp down. And when the Nazis rose to power, it all collapsed. Archives were burned, clubs closed, people disappeared. And that's the part that makes my chest tighten, because I feel like we're living in the same moment right now. We've had decades of progress in LGBTQ rights, but it feels like the backlash is rising again. Book bans, laws attacking trans youth, attempts to erase us from public life. It's frightening to see how quickly things can turn, how rights can be stripped away, how hate can take root if we don't stay vigilant. That's why it's so important that we show up. A few weeks ago, I had friends over to my apartment for a sign-making party for the No Kings rally. And we covered every tabletop in poster board and Sharpies, and we were laughing as we were brainstorming slogans, and we shared snacks, and we were talking about why we were there that day. And it was one of those moments that felt so sacred, and yet it was so simple. We were scared about what was happening in our country, but in that room, there was laughter, there was connection, and there was hope. And later that day, I realized that resistance isn't just about shouting at rallies, because we're going to be doing a lot of that, but it's about gathering and creating art together and reminding ourselves that we belong to each other. We build community by resisting together. Magnus Hirschfeld's legacy teaches us that even in the face of rising authoritarianism, we can choose to live joyfully and authentically. His work and the community that surrounded him in Berlin were acts of defiance as much as they were celebrations of identity. And today, our pride festivals, rallies, and even small gatherings in our living rooms are acts of resistance. Every moment we choose to live openly, to gather in community, and to tell our stories, and to show up for each other, we honor those who came before us, and we protect those generations that will come after us. Joy and resistance are intertwined, and they always have been. And we cannot let fear keep us silent or isolated. We have to keep dancing, loving, and building community in the face of those that would rather see us erased. And that is how we win. That is how we honor our history. And that's how we remind the world and ourselves that queer joy will always find a way, even in the darkest of times. Thanks for joining me on this trip down queer memory lane. If you enjoyed learning about Magnus Hirschfeld and why his fight still matters today, let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I love to hear what stood out to you and how you see his legacy showing up in your own life or in your community. And don't forget to check out the video popping up right over here. It's a little more queer history that you might enjoy. And if you want to discover the LGBTQ icons and uplifting moments that happened on your birthday, head over to myqueerbirthday.com. The link is down in the description below. Until next time, stay strong, stay bold, and keep making history.